My daughter told me not to come for Christmas. Dad's wife will be there, she said. We want her to feel like she's part of the family. I didn't argue. I went back to base for another Christmas on duty. At 12:03 a.m., my daughter called. She was crying. Mom, why did the Pentagon just call Dad? I said okay, and I meant it. 6 Christmases on duty since the divorce. That was the count in my head before she'd even finished the sentence, before I'd even had a chance to feel anything about it. One more wasn't going to kill me. I'd spent one Christmas sleeping in a tent overseas years earlier, another eating rations out of a foil pouch while the temperature outside dropped below anything a human body should have to tolerate. Sitting alone in my apartment or pulling an overnight shift at the operations center didn't rank particularly high on the list of hardships I'd survived. 26 years in logistics and operations does something to a person. It teaches you to sort problems by size before you let yourself feel anything about them. A missed Christmas invitation is small. A missed supply convoy is large. I'd learned the difference the hard way, and once you learn it, you can't unlearn it, even when the small thing sits in your chest for days afterward. My daughter's voice on the phone had that particular careful quality people use when they're trying to deliver bad news gently, like they're carrying something breakable across a room and don't want to be the one who drops it. So Dad and his wife are hosting Christmas this year, she'd said. I know, I told her, because I did know. It had been the plan for weeks. Her parents are flying in, she continued. That's nice, I said. Then the pause. The kind of pause that tells you somebody is about to ask for something they already suspect is unfair. We really want her to feel like she's part of the family, my daughter said. I understood the sentence perfectly. I understood the effort behind it too. The diplomatic phrasing, the careful avoidance of anything that could sound like an accusation. What she meant, underneath all of it, was that my presence complicated the picture she was trying to build. Not because anyone hated me, because 2 mothers in one room on one holiday makes for an uncomfortable photograph. And my daughter, bless her, was trying to keep everyone comfortable at the same time, which is a task that has never once been possible in the history of families. It'll just be easier if it's immediate family, she added. And there it was, immediate family. 2 words that managed to erase over 3 decades of being exactly that in one clean stroke. I told her I understood, because I did, and because arguing wouldn't have changed the outcome, only the mood. She sounded relieved when I said it. We talked another few minutes about nothing in particular, her commute, whether she'd finally replaced the ancient coffee maker that had been dying a slow death on her counter for a year, and then we hung up, and I sat in my recliner for a long while with a mug of coffee that eventually went cold in my hands. The next morning I drove through the gates before sunrise like I had for years, waved through by military police who'd stopped requiring more than a glance at my badge a decade ago. Inside the operations center, the holiday staffing sheet was still short several names, mostly younger soldiers with small kids who understandably wanted to be home for the morning. I found my supervisor in his office reviewing the schedule with the particular frown of a man trying to solve a puzzle that didn't have enough pieces. Still short on Christmas coverage, I said. It wasn't really a question. He looked up, already knowing where the conversation was headed. You worked Thanksgiving, he said. I know. You don't have family plans this year? Plans changed, I told him, and left it there. He didn't push. By that afternoon, word had gotten around that I'd volunteered for the overnight shift, and a few of the younger specialists looked at me like I'd offered to donate a kidney. You really don't mind giving up Christmas? One of them asked, genuinely puzzled. Somebody's got to answer the phones, I said, which was true. And also the kind of answer that ends a conversation before it turns into something more personal than either of us wanted to have at a desk covered in staffing binders. The days leading up to the holiday moved the way they always did. People traded stories about wrapping presents at midnight, burned pies, in-laws who overstayed their welcome by exactly 1 day every year. I smiled in the right places and let the conversations wash over me. A young captain admitted he'd bought his wife the exact same air fryer she'd bought him, and the room laughed the kind of laugh that makes an office feel briefly like a family, which is its own strange comfort when your actual family has quietly rearranged the seating chart without you. On Christmas Eve, I arrived at the operations center a little before 6 in the evening. Someone had taped a plastic wreath to the door, the kind that had clearly been recycled from several previous holidays and would likely survive several more. The cafeteria served turkey and stuffing on disposable trays, and I ate alone near a window while younger soldiers video called their families across the room, holding their phones up to show off new pajamas and half-decorated trees. A boy no older than 4 held a stuffed animal up to a screen with the kind of pure, uncomplicated joy that reminds you why anyone bothers with any of this in the first place. I carried my tray back to the return window, climbed the stairs to my workstation, and settled into the quiet rhythm of an overnight shift. Weather reports, staffing updates. Outside the window, the base housing lights blinked in uneven strings, somebody's decorating scheme clearly assembled by a person with more enthusiasm than symmetry. Just after 11:30, I poured myself another cup of coffee and settled back into my chair. The digital clock on the wall counted down another unremarkable hour of an unremarkable shift, and I remember thinking, with something close to contentment, that this was fine, that I could do this again next year if it came to that some Christmases are simply quieter than others, and quiet isn't the same thing as bad. I had no idea, sitting there with my coffee going lukewarm in a paper cup, that the quietest part of my night was already almost over. At exactly 12:03, my phone lit up on the desk beside my coffee, my daughter's name on the screen. I smiled before I even answered, expecting nothing more complicated than a sleepy Merry Christmas before she went to bed. Well, look who's calling her old mom, I said, already half joking, already ready to hang up a minute later and go back to the quiet hum of the operations center around me. Her voice came back shaking so bad badly I almost didn't recognize it. Mom, she said, and then nothing, just the sound of her trying to breathe evenly and failing. I sat up straight in my chair so fast it rolled backward and hit the wall behind me. Hey, I said, using the tone you use when you need someone to come back to themselves. What's wrong? Talk to me. I don't know everything, she managed. Start with what you do know, I told her, keeping my voice level even though my pulse had already picked up considerably. We were opening presents early, she said, because his wife's parents wanted to leave first thing in the morning. Dad's phone rang around 11:30. He looked at the screen and I've never seen his face go white like that. Around me, the operations center kept humming exactly the way it had a moment earlier. Radios crackled somewhere down the row of desks. A wall of monitors continued quietly tracking weather patterns across the southeast like nothing in the world had shifted, which was strange because something clearly had, at least for me, sitting there gripping a phone that had gone slick with sweat in my palm. What did he do? I asked. He walked outside, she said. And when he came back in, he said it was work. I frowned at that, though she couldn't see it. My ex-husband hadn't worked for any government agency in almost a decade. He'd left contracting years earlier, settled into a quieter civilian life that had nothing to do with anyone at the Pentagon. There wasn't an obvious reason for anyone from that world to be calling him at 11:30 at night on Christmas Eve, and the ones I could think of weren't good. Then another call came, she continued. This time he answered it in the kitchen. His wife followed him in there. I reached for a notepad on my desk without quite deciding to, some old instinct from years of taking down details under pressure kicking in before my brain had caught up to what I was doing. Go on, I said. I heard someone say they needed to speak with both of them, she said. Did they say why? I asked. No. What happened next? Dad started arguing, she said, and that detail landed harder than anything else she'd told me so far. My ex-husband was not a man who raised his voice. In 26 years of marriage, I could count on one hand the number of times I'd heard him do it. He solved problems with lists and schedules, not shouting, and the idea of him arguing with anyone on the phone on Christmas Eve felt almost like hearing that he'd taken up skydiving. He kept saying there had to be some mistake, she said, and his wife locked herself in the guest bedroom. She wouldn't come out. I blinked at that. Locked herself in, I repeated. She wouldn't come out, she said again, her voice cracking slightly on the last word. What about her parents? I asked. They had no idea what was going on, she said. They just sat there staring at each other in the living room like they didn't know what to do with themselves. I glanced at the wall clock above the workstation. 12:08. 5 minutes had passed since I'd answered the phone expecting a holiday greeting, and in that 5 minutes, an entire evening had apparently come apart at the seams somewhere 200 miles away. Then what? I asked. About 20 minutes later, she said. 2 government cars pulled into the neighborhood. My pen stopped moving against the notepad. Government cars, I repeated. I think so, she said. Black SUVs. Did they come to the house? I asked. Yes. Did they come inside? They talked to Dad on the front porch. For how long? I don't know. Maybe 15 minutes. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling tiles without really seeing them. None of this fit together in any shape I could recognize. My ex-husband wasn't a risk taker. If anything, one of the quieter reasons our marriage had worn itself down to nothing was his need to plan every variable in advance. The idea of federal investigators standing on his porch on Christmas Eve felt less like a plot twist and more like mistaken identity, and I told myself that for a moment because it was easier than the alternative. Then she spoke again, her voice smaller now. Mom, they kept asking about military records. I looked down at my notes, at the messy shorthand I'd been scrawling without fully registering what my hand was doing. Military records, I said slowly. They also wanted to talk to his wife, she said, and that detail landed even harder than the one before it. I'd met her exactly a handful of times over the past several years. Pleasant enough, always smiling, the sort of person who called everyone's sweetheart within the first 10 minutes of meeting them. She taught elementary school outside the city and liked posting photos of homemade desserts online. Nothing about any of that suggested a reason for federal investigators to want a conversation with her on a holiday. You don't think Dad's in trouble, do you? She asked, and I could hear how badly she wanted me to say no. I don't know yet, I told her honestly, because lying to her in that moment would have felt like one more small betrayal added to a night that already had enough of them. I've been calling him for 20 minutes, she said. He won't answer. Where is he now? I have no idea. I glanced toward my supervisor's office. He was finishing paperwork at his desk, unaware yet that his overnight coverage was about to become considerably less reliable. I held up one finger toward him through the glass, a silent request for a minute, then turned my attention fully back to the phone. Sweetheart, I said. Are you safe? Yes. Is his wife still there? I think so. She paused. I left the house, Mom. I couldn't stay. I need you to tell me where you are, I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could manage. At my friend's apartment, she said, naming a college roommate I remembered fondly. Good, I said. Lock the door if you're alone. Okay, I'm heading your way. You are, she said, something in her voice shifting slightly, surprise mixed with relief. Yes, I told her. It's Christmas. I noticed, she said, and despite everything, let out a small, weak laugh that lasted maybe 2 seconds before it dissolved back into something closer to tears. That sound stayed with me longer than almost anything else from that call. For the first time in longer than I wanted to admit, when something had gone wrong, my daughter had called me first, not her father. Me. I stood up so quickly my chair rolled backward again and hit the wall a second time. I need to go, I said into the phone. I'm coming to you right now. Stay exactly where you are. I grabbed my coat off the back of my chair and walked straight for my supervisor's office. He looked up before I'd even said a word, already reading something in my face that told him this wasn't a request for a bathroom break. Family emergency, I think, I told him. He didn't ask a single follow-up question. Go, he said. I'll owe you, I told him. You've covered enough holidays for everybody else around here, he said, and waved me toward the door. One of the young younger specialist called out as I passed his desk. "Merry Christmas, ma'am." I smiled without slowing down. "You too," I said, and kept walking out through the double doors and into air cold enough to sting on the way in. My truck started on the second try like it always did. 12 years old and stubborn about mornings the same way I was, I pulled out of the parking lot and headed for the interstate, cutting west once I hit it, and the roads at that hour were close to empty. My headlights stretched out across long stretches of dark highway, and every so often I passed a diner glowing like a lighthouse against the night. About 40 minutes into the drive, my daughter called again. "Any news?" I asked before she'd even said hello. "No," she said. "Have you heard from your dad?" "Nothing." "What about his wife?" "No." She hesitated. "Mom." "Yes," I said. "I feel awful," she told me. "Why?" I asked, though some part of me already suspected the answer. "Because I told you not to come," she said. And there it was, the thing she'd clearly been sitting with since the moment she'd dialed my number. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. "No, honey," I started, but she cut me off gently. "I need to say it," she said. "I thought I was doing the right thing." "I know," I told her. "I didn't want anyone to feel left out. I understand." "I didn't think," she said, her voice cracking again. "I didn't think I'd end up wishing you were there." I swallowed hard against the sudden tightness in my throat. For years after the divorce, some part of me had quietly imagined hearing those exact words from her, and now that they'd actually arrived, they didn't feel like anything close to victory. They just felt sad, the way most true things do when they finally surface. "I've made plenty of mistakes too," I told her. "We're not talking about you," she said. "No, we're talking about family," I agreed, and neither of us spoke again for almost a full minute, just the sound of tires against pavement filling the silence between us. "Do you think Dad lied to us?" she finally asked. "I don't know," I admitted. "And his wife." "I don't know that either," I told her, which was true. My mind kept circling one particular question that refused to resolve itself no matter how many angles I turned it from. Why would anyone from the Pentagon care about my ex-husband's wife? As far as I knew, she'd never served, and nobody in her immediate family had either. Nothing about the shape of it made sense, and the not making sense was somehow worse than if it had simply been bad news I could categorize and file away. Around 1:45 in the morning, my phone rang again, an unknown number this time. I answered through the truck's speaker. "This is his ex-wife," I said, since that was the only introduction that would mean anything to whoever was calling. A calm, measured male voice replied, "Ma'am, I'm a special agent with the Department of Defense." My stomach tightened immediately. I pulled into a rest area without fully deciding to, some instinct telling me this wasn't a conversation to have while navigating traffic. "How can I help you?" I asked. "We understand you're the former spouse of the man in question," he said. "That's right," I confirmed. "We'd appreciate the opportunity to speak with you directly." "About what?" I asked. There was a brief pause on his end. "I'm afraid I can't discuss the details over the phone," he said. "Is he under arrest?" I asked. "I can't answer that," he said. "Is my daughter in danger?" I pressed. "No, ma'am," he said. And that particular answer came quickly enough that I believed it. "I'll be arriving within 2 hours," I told him. "We'll arrange a meeting once you get here," he said, and gave me a phone number that I wrote down on the back of a gas station receipt because it was the only paper within reach. The call ended, and I sat there for a long moment staring through the windshield at an empty parking lot, one 18-wheeler parked at the far end with strings of Christmas lights still glowing faintly around its cab. Something bigger than one unexpected phone call was clearly unfolding, and whatever waited for me at the end of this drive was about to reshape more than a single holiday. I reached the city a little after 4:30 in the morning. It had that particular hush only Christmas morning brings, traffic lights cycling for cars that weren't there, a few scattered people walking dogs bundled up against the cold. My daughter was waiting outside her friend's building when I pulled up, and the second she spotted my truck, she ran across the parking lot toward it, something she hadn't done since she was maybe 14 years old. She climbed into the passenger seat and wrapped both arms around me before I'd even put the truck in park. "I'm sorry," she whispered against my shoulder. I held her for a few seconds without saying anything, because some conversations can wait, but that hug clearly couldn't. When she finally leaned back, I noticed she was still wearing yesterday's holiday sweater, her mascara run down in 2 dark lines, eyes swollen from crying long enough that even a full night's sleep wouldn't have erased the evidence. "Have you eaten anything?" I asked. She shook her head. "I'm not hungry," she said. "Well, I am," I told her, and she looked at me with something between confusion and disbelief. "If we're about to sit down with the federal government," I said, "I'm not doing that on an empty stomach." That earned the first real smile I'd seen from her all night, small and tired but genuine. We found an old diner a few miles away, one of those places that never closes no matter the calendar, maybe 6 other customers scattered around, mostly truck drivers and a couple of police officers finishing up a night shift. The waitress poured coffee without asking if we wanted it. "You two look like you've had a rough night," she said, not unkindly. "You could say that," I told her. My daughter picked at a plate of scrambled eggs while I kept half an eye on the front window, watching headlights pass on the road outside. At exactly 6 o'clock, my phone rang. The investigator. "We're ready whenever you are," he said, and gave me an address that turned out not to belong to any police station, but to a federal office building on the edge of downtown. 20 minutes later, my daughter and I walked through a metal detector and into a conference room with beige walls, a long table, and coffee that smelled like it had been sitting in the pot since sometime the previous afternoon. The investigator looked to be somewhere in his mid-40s, neat haircut, dark suit, a voice that stayed calm no matter what he was saying. Another agent sat beside him, a woman he introduced simply as his colleague. We shook hands, and the investigator waited until everyone had settled into their seats before opening a thick folder in front of him. "Thank you for coming in," he said. "I'd rather know why I'm here," I told him, which felt fair given the circumstances. "I understand," he said. "We're investigating fraudulent claims involving military survivor benefits." I frowned at that. "I'm not following," I said. "We believe your former husband's current wife falsely represented herself for several years as the surviving spouse of a deceased service member," he explained. For a moment, I genuinely thought I'd misheard him. "I'm sorry, what?" I said. He repeated it, almost word for word, patient in the way people are when they've had to deliver a strange piece of information to multiple confused people already that same day. I stared at him. "She wasn't married before him," I said. "Correct," the investigator confirmed. "So how could she claim to be someone's widow?" "Through forged documentation," he said. And beside me, she made a small sound like the air had gone out of her. The second agent slid several copies of paperwork across the table toward us. Names, benefit forms, copies of identification, photographs. One picture showed her standing beside a memorial display at a charity event, wearing a black dress and a small gold star pin she had absolutely no claim to. Another showed her speaking at what looked like a fundraiser for veterans, a microphone in hand, an audience of attentive faces looking back at her like she belonged in that role. "I've never seen any of this," she whispered. "Neither had I." The investigator folded his hands on top of the folder. "Over the last several years," he said, "she attended multiple events identifying herself as the widow of a soldier killed overseas." "But she isn't," I said, more to myself than to him. "No," he confirmed. "Then why would anyone believe her?" I asked. "Because she had convincing documents," he said, tapping the folder gently. "Documents we now know were falsified." I felt my stomach tighten in a way that had nothing to do with the diner coffee still sitting uneasily in my system. I'd spent nearly half my life surrounded by military families. I'd attended memorial services. I'd stood beside wives receiving folded flags. Pretending to belong to that particular community wasn't just dishonest in some abstract legal sense. It was personal in a way that made the whole thing land somewhere much deeper than simple financial fraud. She covered her mouth with one hand. "Oh my God," she said quietly. "There's more," the second agent said, her voice gentle but unmistakably firm, and I braced myself because I already suspected whatever came next wasn't going to be easier to hear than what had already been said. "The investigation indicates your former husband became aware of the fraud approximately 2 years ago," the investigator said, and her chair squeaked as she looked up too fast. "What?" she said. "We have evidence suggesting he did," the investigator said. "No," she said, shaking her head over and over. "No, he wouldn't." The investigator didn't argue with her. He simply reached into the folder and placed another document on the table in front of us, a printed series of emails. I forced myself to look at it. One message from him read that they needed to stop using that particular story, that someone was eventually going to ask questions. Her reply, underneath it, said they never do. I read it twice to make sure I hadn't misunderstood the tone. I hadn't. Another message further down the page, still in his words, said that as long as the paperwork matched, they'd be fine. She pushed the papers away from herself, like they'd suddenly gotten hot. "I don't want to read anymore," she said. I understood the impulse completely, but years in the operations world had taught me something important a long time ago. Facts don't become less true just because they're painful to sit with. "We're trying to understand exactly how much he knew," the investigator said. "Were they collecting money from this?" I asked, because someone in the room needed to keep asking practical questions even if it felt cold to be the one doing it. "Among other things," he said, and explained that she'd accepted speaking honorariums, charitable donations, travel reimbursements, and assistance programs specifically intended for Gold Star families. She'd also received discounts from local businesses who wanted to honor military survivors in whatever small way they could manage. Each individual amount hadn't been enormous on its own, he said. Together, over several years, they added up to tens of thousands of dollars. She buried her face in both hands. "My dad helped hide this," she said, her voice muffled and small. "We're still determining exactly what role he played," the investigator said carefully, which felt like the kind of sentence designed to be technically true without offering any real comfort. I leaned back in my chair, and the room suddenly felt considerably smaller than it had 10 minutes earlier. My marriage hadn't ended because he was dishonest. It had ended slowly. Two people simply growing into different shapes over enough years that the original fit no longer worked. But I'd always respected one specific thing about him even after everything else had worn thin: his integrity. Now even that certainty was showing cracks I hadn't expected to find. As we left the conference room, a man in an old service jacket walked past in the hallway, glancing at the paperwork tucked under the investigator's arm, without knowing any of the specifics. "Every year somebody tries to wear a uniform they never earned," he muttered, mostly to himself, and kept walking. But the words stayed with me long after he'd disappeared around the corner. Outside the building, my daughter finally asked the question we'd both been carefully avoiding since we'd sat down. "What happens now?" she said. "I don't know," I told her honestly. "If this all comes out," she said, tears gathering again, "everybody's going to know." She wasn't worried about gossip in that moment. She was worried about losing the version of her father she'd spent her whole life believing in, and I understood that fear completely because some quiet part of me was grieving the exact same loss. I could have driven away from all of it that afternoon. Nobody was making me stay involved. I could have told the investigators I didn't know anything and gone quietly back to base. Instead, when the investigator called a few days later asking if I'd be willing to review some old event photographs from military charity functions, I said yes, almost before I'd finished thinking it through. "Facts first," he'd told me once. "Opinions can wait." It reminded me of an old command sergeant major's line, "Slow is smooth, smooth is fast." So instead of chasing rumors, I started with what I actually knew. I pulled out old address books I'd never bothered to throw away, contact lists from charity events I'd helped organize years earlier. One name led to another. Some people remembered her immediately. Others needed a specific fundraiser or banquet named before the memory surfaced. One afternoon, I drove out to meet an old colleague from my finance years for lunch. She studied my face before I'd said a word. "You sound sounded serious on the phone, she said. I am, I told her, and explained only what I'd been authorized to discuss. I remember her, she said. A military appreciation dinner years back. She kept telling people her husband died overseas. Did anyone question her? I asked. No, she said, looking at me like the answer should have been obvious. Because decent people don't assume someone would lie about something like that. That sentence stayed with me the rest of the day. Decent people don't expect cruelty dressed up as grief. Over the following 2 weeks, I met with several more former colleagues. Each conversation added another small piece to a picture nobody had seen in full yet. One volunteer remembered her collecting donations at a table near the entrance of some event. Another recalled introducing her as a Gold Star widow during a community gathering, spoken with total sincerity because there'd been no reason to doubt it. Someone else remembered my ex-husband standing quietly beside her, smiling politely while she thanked a room full of people for supporting families like the one she'd claimed to belong to. Every individual story sounded harmless in isolation. Together, they painted something else entirely. The investigator called every few days with small updates. We're making progress, he'd say. Good, I'd tell him. What about him, I'd ask, meaning my ex-husband. We're still sorting that out, he'd say, and that answer never once changed. Meanwhile, word had started spreading through the wider community. Not the actual facts, just rumors. By the second week of the new year, people had invented stories that sounded like plots from bad television. Someone claimed he'd stolen classified documents. Someone else insisted she'd been some kind of foreign operative. None of it was true. The real story was quieter and sadder than any of the invented versions. Then the whispers turned toward me directly. My daughter called one evening, her voice tight. Mom, she said, I can hear it in your voice already. I ran into Dad's neighbor today and she said, people think you're behind all of this. I didn't answer right away. They're saying you're just trying to get revenge because he remarried, she continued. I looked out my apartment window at rain sliding slowly down the glass and wondered how long it would take for that particular story to reach every corner of a community that had once trusted me without question. You don't seem surprised, she said. I'm not, I told her. Whenever people don't have access to the truth, they usually reach for the simplest explanation available. The bitter ex-wife makes an easy villain to imagine. I told her she was wrong, she said. Thank you, I said. But then she added, quieter, I think Dad believes it too. That particular sentence hurt in a way the anonymous rumors hadn't managed to. Not because he blamed me for any of it, because after 30 years together, some part of me had expected him to know better, to extend me the basic decency of doubt in the other direction. A week later, I found an envelope tucked under my office door with no return address. Inside was a single folded sheet of notebook paper, one sentence in block letters. Some families deserve to stay buried. No signature, just that. I showed it to base security anyway. I still locked my apartment door twice that night, and the night after that. A few days after that, the investigator asked if I'd look through a stack of photographs from various veterans events over the previous several years. Most were ordinary banquet pictures, people shaking hands, holding certificates, smiling the particular smile people wear for cameras at fundraisers. Then I stopped at one photo in particular. There, I said. The investigator looked over my shoulder. What caught your attention? He asked. The woman standing beside her, I said. Do you know her? He asked. Yes, I told him. Her son had actually been killed while serving overseas. I'd attended his memorial service years earlier. I'd watched her accept a folded flag with my own eyes, watched her hands shake as she took it. If the woman beside her in this photograph had stood there pretending to share that same loss, I couldn't finish the thought out loud. The investigator quietly wrote down the name. A few days later, he called back. You were right, he said. What happened? I asked. She believed she was talking to a fellow Gold Star spouse, he said. I closed my eyes. So she trusted her, I said. Yes. And she let her, I said. Yes, he confirmed. For the first time since the whole nightmare had started, something shifted in my chest, anger finally pushing past the sadness that had been sitting there for weeks. Not loud anger, something colder, quieter, the kind that settles in and simply refuses to leave. A few evenings later, I attended a monthly breakfast gathering with several old friends from my years in service. A retired colonel pulled me aside. I've been hearing things, he said. I'm sure you have, I told him. You look tired, he said. I am. He nodded toward two empty chairs. Sit, he said. After I'd talked for a while, he stirred his coffee slowly. You still feel responsible for protecting your daughter's relationship with her father, he said, and he wasn't wrong. I don't want to be the one who destroys what's left of it, I told him. You aren't, he said. The person who tells the truth isn't the one who breaks the trust. What if she never forgives me for this? I asked. Then give her time, he said. Truth doesn't get louder because you raise your voice. It gets stronger with evidence. Driving home, I kept turning those words over. For weeks, I'd quietly asked myself whether helping this investigation made me vindictive. The honest answer surprised me. I didn't want that at all. I wanted the pretending to stop, and I wanted women like the one in that photograph to never again wonder whether the stranger hugging them at a memorial service had earned the right to stand there. The revenge I'd assumed I wanted was slowly turning into something else. Not payback, accountability. Still, the hardest days were ahead, because evidence doesn't stay buried in folders forever. Sooner or later, it would walk into a courtroom, and there would be no more hiding behind rumors. Only the truth. By the time spring arrived, the investigation was no longer any kind of secret. It hadn't turned into national news, but around the base and the military communities nearby, people were talking. Most still didn't know the full shape of it, only that it involved benefits fraud, a local charity, and a couple everyone had assumed they understood. The federal prosecutor called on a Tuesday afternoon. We're ready to move forward, he said, and I'd known that call was coming for weeks, but hearing the actual words still made my stomach tighten. A hearing was scheduled at the federal courthouse. It wouldn't be the kind of dramatic courtroom scene people expect expect from television. Most real courtrooms move methodically, one piece of evidence at a time, and somehow that made it more powerful, not less. My daughter called the night before. I don't know if I can go, she said. You don't have to, I told her. But if I don't, she started, and stopped. If you don't, you'll always wonder. I finished for her, she sighed. I hate that you're right, she said. I don't enjoy being right about this particular thing, I told her, and that made her laugh. Just for a second. I'll meet you there, she said. The courthouse was already busy when I arrived. Veterans in jackets covered with service patches stood quietly in small groups near the entrance. A few reporters waited behind metal barricades, cameras pointed hopefully toward the front steps, waiting for someone to say something dramatic. Nobody did. He arrived with his attorney. For the first time in months, I saw my former husband face to face, and he looked older, not from any gray hair, but from carrying himself like a man who hadn't slept properly in a very long time. Our eyes met for only a moment. Neither of us waved. His wife walked several steps behind him, gone the cheerful woman who used to post smiling holiday photos online. She looked exhausted, no makeup, shoulders slumped, staring at the ground as photographers called her name. Inside, everything felt surprisingly ordinary. Wooden benches, a flag standing in the corner, the quiet shuffle of papers being sorted at the front tables. The judge entered exactly on time and the hearing began. The prosecutor laid out the case without ever raising his voice. He explained how survivor programs depend entirely on honest documentation, described the falsified applications, the altered records, the financial benefits collected under a false identity. Then came the witnesses. A charity director testified she'd been invited to speak because organizers believed she was a legitimate Gold Star widow. A local business owner described donating thousands of dollars in services meant for military families. Each individual story sounded generous on its own. Each act of kindness had been quietly built on top of a lie. Then the Gold Star mother took the stand. She walked slowly, holding a folded handkerchief in one hand. I remembered standing beside her years earlier at her son's memorial service, and she still carried herself with that same quiet dignity now. The prosecutor asked a simple question. Why did you trust the defendant? He asked. She looked toward the woman she'd once considered a friend. Because I believed she understood what it meant to lose a child to service, she said. The room went completely still. I invited her into my home, she continued. I introduced her to other families. I cried with her. She paused, and her voice caught slightly. I didn't know I was crying with a stranger wearing someone else's grief. Nobody moved. Even the reporters in the back stopped typing for a moment. The woman on trial lowered her head and didn't look up again for the rest of the testimony. Then the investigator took the stand and walked the court through financial records, email exchanges, event registrations, identification documents. Nothing dramatic, just facts laid out one after another with the same patient rhythm he'd used in every conversation I'd had with him over the past several months. Finally, the prosecutor displayed several emails on a monitor for the court to see. One message from my ex-husband appeared first. Someone's eventually going to verify your records, it read. Her reply followed underneath it. Nobody ever does. Another message came up after that. We need to stop before this gets bigger, he'd written. Her answer. After this fundraiser, we're done. The fundraiser, everyone in that room now understood, had not been the end of anything. It had continued for almost 2 more years after that message was sent. His attorney advised him to testify. I never learned exactly why, whether they believed honesty might soften whatever consequences were coming, or whether there simply wasn't another option left on the table by that point. He walked to the witness stand and for the first few minutes answered everything quietly. Yes, he'd discovered who she really was. Yes, they'd argued about it. Yes, he'd told her to stop. Then the prosecutor asked the question everyone in that room had been waiting for since the hearing began. After learning the truth, did you continue attending events where your wife falsely represented herself as a Gold Star widow? He asked. My ex-husband closed his eyes for a long moment. Yes, he said. Were you aware donations were being accepted during that time? The prosecutor asked. Yes. Were you aware businesses were providing benefits based on those same claims? Yes. Why didn't you report it? The prosecutor finally asked, and my ex-husband's voice dropped so low I had to lean forward slightly just to catch it. I convinced myself it wasn't hurting anyone, he said. The prosecutor didn't respond to that. He simply returned to his table and let the silence that followed do whatever work it needed to do on its own. That silence was heavier than any shouted argument could have possibly been. I looked over at my daughter. Tears were running down her face, not loud sobbing, just quiet tears. The particular kind that come when the person you've admired your entire life suddenly becomes someone you barely recognize sitting in front of you. Court recessed for lunch. As people filtered into the hallway, a local reporter approached me. Would you like to comment? She asked. I shook my head. This day isn't about me, I told her. What does justice look like to you? She pressed. I thought about that for a moment before answering. Justice isn't humiliating people, I said. It's making sure the truth finally reaches the people who deserved it all along. That afternoon, the judge accepted her guilty plea to multiple fraud-related charges. Sentencing would come later, but the facts were now part of the public record for good. My ex-husband wasn't charged with the same offenses, but the court made clear that his years of cooperation with the deception carried serious consequences of its own. He would spend years repaying what should never have been accepted in the first place. As people left the courthouse, nobody celebrated. No applause, no cheering. Real life rarely offers those kinds of clean moments. Instead, there was something quieter. Veterans gathered around the Gold Star mother in the hallway, one by one, taking turns hugging her. Not because anyone had won anything, but because she'd finally been told the truth after carrying a lie she never knew she was carrying. My daughter walked over to me. For a long moment, she couldn't speak at all. Then she reached for my hand. I understand now, she said. I squeezed her fingers, and neither of us needed to add anything anything further to that sentence. By the end of summer, the reporters had stopped calling. Around base, people had gone back to talking about training schedules and weather forecasts instead. His wife had been sentenced to probation, financial restitution, and a permanent record that would follow her for the rest of her life. She resigned quietly from her teaching position before the district could complete its own review. My ex-husband faced years of repaying money tied to the fraud. One Saturday morning in October, my phone rang while I was trimming the small maple tree outside my apartment. It was him. I stared at the screen for a long moment before answering. "I won't keep you long," he said. "I owe you an apology. I blamed you for a long time," he admitted. It was easier than facing what I'd actually done. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. "I appreciate the apology," I told him, and meant it. Before hanging up, he added one more thing. "You raised her better than I ever gave you credit for." "We both raised her," I said, and left it there. A week later, my daughter invited me to lunch. She looked different when I arrived. Not older, lighter, like carrying an honest truth weighed less than carrying years of quiet confusion ever had. "I keep replaying that phone call," she admitted over the meal. "The one where I told you not to come." "I remember," I told her gently. "I thought if I arranged everything just right, we'd finally feel like one whole family," she said. "You confuse peace with pretending," I told her, and she nodded slowly, tears gathering again, but different tears this time, the kind that come from relief instead of grief. That December, the little artificial tree came out of the closet again, still leaning slightly to the left, the way it always had. A week before the holiday, my supervisor stopped by my desk. "Volunteering for Christmas duty again?" he asked. "I can cover part of the morning," I told him. "Only part," he said, raising an eyebrow. "My daughter's expecting me for dinner this year," I said, and he smiled like he'd been hoping I'd say exactly that. Christmas morning arrived cold and bright. I worked a partial shift, answered a few calls, and by noon, I was in my truck heading toward my daughter's house. She opened the door before I'd even knocked, the smell of dinner drifting out behind her. "Merry Christmas, Mom," she said, and pulled me into a hug right there on the porch. Inside, the table wasn't crowded, no complicated seating arrangements, no walking carefully around old wounds, just the two of us, trying to do better than the year before. After dinner, she handed me a small gift, a hand-painted wooden ornament shaped like a pickup truck carrying a crooked little tree. I laughed the moment I saw it. "It leans," I said. "So does yours," she said, and we hung it together side by side on a tree that had never once needed to be perfectly straight to still hold everything it was supposed to.